Hello, everybody. Um, we're going to be talking again today and continuing our study on what we call the gospel, which is a pretty broad term, actually. Um, I'm going to talk today a little bit about what I believe to be a key component of our gospel, which is the idea of covenant. I'm going to start by reading in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy verse 9 says, "Know therefore that the Lord your God, He is a God, the faithful God, who keeps His covenant and His loving kindness to 1,000 generations with those who love Him and keep His commandments." This idea of our God being a covenant keeping God, I think, is very important. And I want to talk about it a little bit here in the beginning through the context of what we've spent some time setting up, which is our biblical worldview. I think it's good for us to understand that the Bible itself tells us that the world has been put under a council of gods. When we looked at Deuteronomy 32, we saw that, referring back to what happened in Genesis 11 and the time of Babel, when Nimrod had all the people under his control and they were trying to build some kind of technological tower that would not really reach into heaven where God lives. Nobody would be foolish enough to think they would build a tower that would even get outside of Earth's atmosphere, much less up into some spiritual space that where the gods live. But I think what they were doing was based on the technology and the understanding that they had in those days. They were trying to build a tower that would allow them to communicate with their gods. And there's a lot there that comes out of an understanding of the pre-flood history and what was going on in Genesis 6 with the giants and all that. But Deuteronomy 32:8 says that God came down and separated them into nations, and He placed them under the watch of the sons of God, or the council of gods that are now governing and overseeing the nations. We need to understand that we live in their world. We live in a world that's informed by and controlled by this pantheon of gods. And it's my understanding that there were at least 7 other gods that were over this council of gods. It's mentioned in Psalm 82, by the way, and being judged in Psalm 82, are being at least warned of a future judgment that's coming their way for not ruling the nations according to the wisdom of God, but doing it in their own wisdom. So there's 70 of those guys at least. That seems to be the agreed upon number, and that goes back to the Table of Nations in Deuteronomy 10 and 11 that are listed there. They all come from the line of Noah after he gets off the ark, and the sons of Seth. There's 70 nations listed there in Deuteronomy, and so God splits them up into those 70 patriarchal nations that are listed there in Genesis 11. Excuse me. And in Deuteronomy 32, Moses tells us that when God split them up like that, He placed them under these sons of God, these spiritual beings. And so the situation is, as we live today, that the nations are still under the influence and under the control of those gods. The New Testament tells us this over and over. Paul says that Satan is the god of this world. John the Apostle says that the whole world lies under his power. Jesus in John 13 called Satan the ruler of this world. It's clear that the early Christians and Jesus himself had a biblical worldview that informed them that Satan was in control. We are living in his realm. We're swimming in his cesspool, if you want to think of it that way. Now, in the middle of that, God comes down and chooses a people for himself, Israel. He chooses Abraham and says, I'm going to make a people out of you that'll be for me. The rest of them have been given over. I think Paul agrees with this in Romans 1. And he says that God gave them over to the things they wanted to do. He gave them over to the lust of their flesh. He needed a people for himself. He chose Abraham to start and built a nation and wanted a people that would function as priests on a planet that was now controlled by fallen gods. Israel was to be that. And so the situation was and is that we live in a world where this council of gods who are ruling the nations and under the auspices of Satan and the upper level of gods, there seems to be 7 wandering angels who are kind of like over that pantheon of 70. And I can't get into all of that right now, but that seems to be what the understanding we get out of early history and out of the Bible. That pantheon of gods is determined to squash the light that God is trying to bring through his plan into this planet. Ever since the days of Abraham and ever since the days of Israel and into today, that pantheon of gods is focused on destroying what God is doing. And when you understand that, and you look at everything that's going on in that light, it helps explain a lot of what we see. It helps explain why everything seems to be fighting against Christianity. It explains why you can talk about darkness and Satan and homosexuality and all the dark things all you want on TV. You get on the news, you can talk about it all you want. You can bring it up in school. You can talk to your teachers about it, but don't you dare bring up Christ or the gospel or the cross or any kind of restraints on people's activity. Don't dare try to bring it up. You will be shut down and ostracized, if not kicked out of school. You will never be allowed back on any of the news media. Why is that? Well, it's because we're swimming in their pool. And when we understand it, it explains all of that. In the midst of that, we have a God who comes along and says, well, guess what? I'm a covenant-keeping God. I will keep covenant with you if you'll enter into covenant with me and walk according to the stipulations of the covenant. This is something that, you know, I think it's essential for us to understand it. What is a covenant? And why is God chosen to relate to humanity through covenantal relationships? Probably the easiest and clearest example we have of covenant is the marriage covenant that we enter into with another person. And we say things in there that are, or we do things. There are things implied in the marriage covenant that are covenantal, that speak of the characteristics and the elements of covenant, like lifetime devotion, lifetime commitment, lifetime loyalty and faithfulness to the other person. Those are all elements of covenant. Holman Bible Dictionary describes covenant as a pact or treaty or an alliance or an agreement between two parties of either equal or unequal authority. Well, marriage covenant is obviously um, an agreement between two parties of equal authority. We're both human, man and woman. You might argue that there's different roles to be played there, but at the human level, at the level of our essence, that's a covenant between equal parties. Merriam-Webster describes covenant, a written agreement or promise, usually under seal between two or more parties, especially for the performance of some action. So even the dictionaries, even that pagan world out there describes covenant as being a binding agreement between two or more parties. The exact idea or the exact uh, etymology or origin of the word covenant is really hard to nail down, but the general agreement or the general consensus is that the term came at somewhere along the way, it came to represent a binding agreement between the parties. There are early records of covenant form. We have discovered 20th century archaeology has turned up evidence of the Hittite culture, the Hittite nation, and uncovered artifacts that were depicting covenant agreements and showing us the elements of some of the early pre-Israel, pre-Abraham ideas of covenant. These particular covenants were mostly of the type that we call suzerainty. There's two kinds of covenants. There's suzerainty or parity. The marriage covenant would be a parity covenant because it's between partners of equal parity or equal authority or significance. A suzerainty covenant is a covenant between a sovereign authority and what would be described as his vassals. The early Hittite covenants were of the suzerainty type mostly because it was between the Hittite king and the vassals of his kingdom. And there would be certain elements that were found in those covenants. They were written out by the suzerain, by the sovereign, and the words that the sovereign would put out and put to his covenant were called the words of the sovereign, or the word, and it was just the agreement. It would typically fall along the form of the sovereign explaining what he would do for faithful vassals. He would provide a place to live. He would provide the needs of life, and he would provide protection. He would provide a society in which people would be treated fairly among themselves, and he would require of the vassals to treat one another fairly. And those are the kinds of things that he would put in and write into the stipulations of his covenant. You usually didn't have much choice if you were going to live within his domain. You either agreed to the covenant or you were eliminated or told to get out. But what we find is that in God's covenant with Israel, we find that he used the covenant form as it existed in the earlier cultures. And you can find a lot of parallelism, a lot of the same elements of covenant in the covenant of God with Israel as was found in the earlier covenants of like the Hittite Empire. So why is God doing that? Why would he go about doing it that way? Think about the fact that the whole earth was living in this polytheist cosmos. The whole earth is part of the polytheist understanding. They all have their mythologies. We call them mythologies, but it's really early history, where they all believed in these other gods. And these gods manifested themselves in various ways. And all people were believing that Zeus and Baal and all these other gods were the gods. Jehovah chooses Abraham, forms him into a nation of what we call the Israelites or the Hebrews. And now he wants to make covenant with them. So he's going to relate to them. He's going to relate that to them in their understanding. They understand the world in its polytheist form. And so he's going to make a covenant with them in a manner that they understand, in a context that they understand. The one difference is that God says, he makes a distinction between himself and the other gods by saying, I'm a God who keeps my covenants, implying that those other gods may or may not. And in most cases, they're not going to. Deuteronomy 7 is a classic place to look at this, because God is giving instructions through Moses to Israel as they're about to enter into the land. They're standing on the edge of the promised land. They have not entered yet. Moses is given final instructions in Deuteronomy because he's not going to be allowed to go into the land. So he's given his last instruction and handing the baton of authority over to Joshua. And so he's speaking to Israel as he's telling them, you're on the precipice. You're going to go in and live in this land, and God is going to be your God, and you're going to be his people. And these are my final instructions. So in Deuteronomy 7, he says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you are. They were not only greater and stronger, they were bigger. We know that from Numbers. When they spied out the land 40 years prior to this, they went and they said, my gosh, there are things living in that land that make us appear like grasshoppers. They're huge. They were the giants that were formed in Deuteronomy 6, and the land is full of them. They're full of some of the original offspring of the fallen angels and women, and then the generations of offspring that came following that. And we know this to be true because David ends up fighting one of them named Goliath, and there are other examples of these giant offspring who are still in the land. They're part of this polytheist pantheon of gods and minions that are still governing the nations, and were actually ruling the nations back in those days. And God says, when I bring you into their land, these nations that are stronger than you, and I deliver them into your hand, and you defeat them, you need to utterly destroy them. Make no covenant with them, and show them no favor. Why? Because they're corrupt. They're a corrupted line, a bloodline of beings that are the result of this intermingling of the heavenly and the earthly families of God that is quickly described to us in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons. That's exactly what they did in Genesis 6. Moses is saying, you can't do that again. Don't do that again. They will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So we see that all of this is in the context of God bringing the people into the land in this polytheist world, and Moses is given instructions to them about when you enter into this land, you don't serve their gods. And he tells them over and over again, these gods were given to those people. They are their gods Think of what Paul said in Romans 1. God gave them over. They're now serving those other gods. Um, but the Lord chose you, it says in verse 7. The Lord did not set his love on you or choose you because you were more in number than any of these people, for you were the fewest, actually. Especially when he chose Abraham, there was one. But because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers, the Lord brought you out of Egypt by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now therefore know that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God who keeps his covenant. And there's a distinction being made there that we've already talked about. God is the faithful covenant keeping God, and he chooses to relate to people through covenant, a binding agreement that binds the vassals. It doesn't bind the sovereign. If the sovereign was bound by a covenant, he would cease being sovereign. He would now be a subject of the covenant itself. And that doesn't happen. The vassals are bound by it. But the sovereign remains free. The vassals have to trust in the good graces or the sovereign being a faithful benefactor. When he says, I'm going to do these things for you, you have to just believe and trust. The vassal has to accept it in faith. May not have much choice, but as believers in God, we do have a choice. He doesn't force us to accept his covenant or his covenant terms. So we have to come into this covenant believing that our God is a faithful God, a generous benefactor. And when he says he'll provide for us, when he says he'll provide protection, or when he'll guide us by his grace, we have to believe him and trust him in that. And we just have to follow the stipulations, the words of the covenant, or the words of the sovereign we have to follow so that we can stay in that covenant relationship and stay in that covenant agreement with God. There's a lot of the elements of the covenants that are really kind of interesting. We don't have time to go over all of them, but just for example, one of the things the Hittite king would always do would be to recount the history between himself and his vassals, or between his subjects. And he would tell them, I have history with your parents, history with your ancestors, and so I'm going to be faithful to you. And what does God say? We already read it. He said, I didn't choose you because you were great in number or anything like that, but I chose you to keep an oath that I swore to your forefathers. So I have history with your forefathers, and therefore I'm going to be faithful to you because of that history and because of the oaths I swore to your forefathers. One of the things that a Hittite god would demand was loyalty to him alone. You could not have any other kings. One of the first things God says in his covenant is you can't have any other gods. You got to be faithful to me. You can't bring, in a Hittite covenant, you couldn't offer refuge to any outsiders without the knowledge of the king. God tells Israel, you can't have covenant with any of the other people. You can't bring them into your land. They will pervert you, and they will let you. They will lead you into worshiping their gods. So there's all these parallel ideas and the idea of covenant. It's interesting. I have a document on this. If anybody's interested, I can give it to you. But it's just interesting to see how God dealt with Israel in terms and in ways that they would understand, because they were familiar with some of these earlier covenant forms. The covenant required faithfulness out of the people. And I think the covenant is a two-way street. I think we make a mistake, especially in new covenant ideas, when we think that covenant is a one-way street. That it's just all God making promises to us with no requirements laid upon us. We call it a covenant of grace, and we're going to talk about that. That's really the point I want to get to. We say, well, the new covenant's a covenant of grace, right? I mean, what's the point of the new covenant? Well, let's talk about that for a minute. What was the problem with the old covenant? Why was there a need for a new covenant at all? In fact, I'm going to turn to Hebrews and read from chapter 8, verse 7. The writer of Hebrews is talking about a new covenant. The letter of Hebrews is basically a comparison between the old and the new. What we have in the letter to Hebrews is we have a group of people that are being heavily persecuted, and they're under so much pressure and so much persecution that they get this idea that, well, if we just abandon Christianity and go back to Judaism, we can get out from under this persecution. We can eliminate or at least alleviate a lot of the pressure. They're losing their houses. They're being put in prisons, and all kinds of things are being a pressure. They're just being pressured to give up their faith and abandon it. And so they're entertaining the idea. And the writer of Hebrews, who I think was probably Apollos or Barnabas, who was a second generation Christian, in other words, not one of the original apostles, and you can get that out of chapter 2 if you look at it there. But the writer is trying to encourage his readers not to do what they're thinking about doing. Don't give up the Christian faith and go back to Judaism to get out from under this pressure. And so he's comparing the old to the new throughout the book. And in the old covenant, the new covenant, even what was the problem in the old and what's the benefit of the new. In chapter 8, verse 7, he says, if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. Pretty clear, pretty easy to understand. The first covenant had problems. Otherwise, there would have been no reason for a second one, the new one. What was the problem? Well, the problems were numerous. The problems were it required obedience. We just read it in Deuteronomy 7. Moses, the writer of Deuteronomy, said, God is a faithful covenant-keeping God for those who love him and keep his commandments. It's a misunderstanding. It's a tragic misunderstanding to think that God is a God who just winks at sin or overlooks our disobedience and our rebellion, but still bound himself to keep covenant with us. That is not the case. In fact, he did not keep covenant with Israel because he did kind of keep covenant with them, because he told them in the covenant that if you disobey, you're going to go into exile, and they disobeyed and went into exile. He did not keep the blessings of the covenant that he promised would be theirs, because they didn't follow, they didn't obey. They broke covenant. Jeremiah says that in Jeremiah 31. What was the problem with the old covenant? You broke it. You disobeyed. So the problem with the old covenant was it required an obedience that was impossible because of the flesh. And the New Testament teaches us this over and over. It was weak. Paul says that the old covenant was weak through the flesh. And so obedience was impossible. What's the benefit of the new covenant? Why is the new covenant better than the old covenant? The writer of Hebrews quotes from Jeremiah 31. I want to go back and read that, but I don't want to take too much time. I'm trying to keep this under the typical 50 minutes here. Hebrews 8, verse 8, right after the writer says, the first covenant had faults, so there was a need for a better one. He quotes Jeremiah 31, and he says, Behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I will effect a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and I did not care for them, says the Lord. In other words, he's saying they broke the covenant. In Jeremiah, it actually uses that terminology. You broke it. You broke the covenant. Verse 10. Now this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, says the Lord, I will put my laws into their minds, and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people, and they shall not teach everyone his fellow citizen and everyone his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know the Lord. Ezekiel had another take on the same idea. Ezekiel says that there's a better covenant coming. He prophesies the better covenant. He says, in that covenant, I will put my spirit within you, and I will cause you to walk in my statutes. The new covenant is better than the old covenant because it consists of a power to obey. It imparts and gives the power to obey. And that's the difference. That's why the old covenant had fault, and that's why the new covenant is better. Both of them require obedience. Make no mistake about that. Both covenants require faithfulness and obedience on the part of we, the vassals. We're still in covenant with a sovereign God, but the condition on us is obedience. And Jesus makes this clear. I mean, Paul makes it clear. John the Apostle makes it clear. Jesus says, you want to be my disciple, you got to take up your cross and follow me. What's that mean? It means you got to obey like I obeyed. The cross was an act of obedience. Paul says that in Philippians 2, that, Christ obeyed to the point of death. He walked in obedience. Jesus said, you got to take up your cross. Embrace obedience. Paul says he's going to bring the Gentiles in Romans 1:5. He says he's going to bring the Gentiles into the obedience of faith. That's his calling and his mission given to him by God, to bring Gentiles into the obedience of faith. John the Apostle says, if you say you're born of God and you don't obey, you're a liar. You're just fooling yourself, because you cannot be born of God and not obey. That's paraphrasing what he says. If you're born of the Spirit and you're not obeying, there's something wrong. And this is the benefit of the new covenant. Paul says it's the mystery of the new covenant in Colossians 1. The mystery of the new covenant is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Is it a covenant of grace? Yes. What is grace? It's not only forgiveness, it's not only mercy, but it's power. Grace is the power of God, the power of the Spirit abiding in his people, empowering them to walk free of sin. What good would our salvation be if it only forgave us of sin, but left us in bondage to it? That would be a weak salvation, in my opinion. And that would be a salvation a salvation of frustration. It would be a salvation kind of like what Paul explains, or actually a torment like Paul explains in Romans chapter 7. It would be one that would say, well, you can't sin anymore, but you're a slave to sin and you're going to sin. Well, that's like Paul. It's like, I know what I need to do and I can't do it. So what kind of torment is this? And who's going to free me from this body of sin? He almost cries out. You can hear the cry in Romans 7. And this is not Paul's experience. This is not, don't misunderstand. Paul is explaining the plight of man under the under the bondage of the old covenant. The old covenant tells you You can't do these things, and leaves you completely powerless to stop doing those things. That is just an exercise in frustration. That is a weak salvation, if I can say so. Um, God never intended to leave humanity in that state. The better covenant is, I will not only tell you, require obedience from you, I will give you the power to obey. The mystery of this covenant is the Spirit of God abiding in you, Christ in you, the hope of glory, the hope to be set free. It's grace and power. It renders us without excuse. Romans 6, Paul talks about if you're still obeying sin, you're still a slave of sin, and you shouldn't be any longer. Christ in you gives you the power to free you from the bondage of sin. I don't understand, honestly, people who say, well, I've been a Christian for 40 or 50 years and I'm still living in bondage to my sin. There's something not working there. There's something, it's faith. I understand. What did Paul say in Romans 1:5? I'm going to bring the Gentiles into the obedience of faith. It takes faith to understand that Christ lives in you. It takes faith to understand that he can deliver you from the power of sin. It does require faith. It requires a renewing of our mind, as he talks about in Romans 12. You have to have your mind renewed to believe something other than what you've been believing for decades. But I have a problem. I'm just going to be honest with y'all. I have a problem with somebody who says they've been a Christian for 40 years and they're still dealing with the same sin. And I've heard so many people say, well, it's just the way I am. God knows it. He's going to have to accept me the way I am. He's very accepting. I'm not going to deny that. But he doesn't have to accept you the way you are. He doesn't leave you in your sin to stay the way they are. He gave us the power of the Spirit to bring us out of our sin, to set us free of our sin. If that's not true, then I don't understand what Paul's talking about. Christ in you is the hope of what glory? It's the hope of what? It's the hope of being free from our sin. So you can enter in, the writer of Hebrews says, you can enter into the believer's rest. What is that rest? It's freedom from sin. It's freedom from the struggle. We're always going to have to contend with the flesh. Don't get me wrong. We're not going to walk in some kind of state of perfection. As long as you're in the flesh, you're going to have to battle it, and it's going to be tempted by sin. But you do not have to obey it. Paul says, I'm constantly bringing my flesh under submission, constantly bringing it into submission to my will and the will of God. I die daily. I'm crucifying the flesh daily, making it my subject and not obeying it. So you're going to have that struggle. It's going to be there. But the grace of God is there where you can say no. You do not have to do it. And that's what Paul is teaching us in Romans 6. And that's the idea, that's the benefit and the power of the new covenant that makes it better than the old covenant. We're interacting with a God who walks with people in covenant. God says in the New Testament, I'm going to give you the power to walk in my statutes. Do we believe it? He's a God who keeps covenant. He's a God who requires covenant. He chose to relate to us in covenant understanding, in covenant form. It's a binding agreement between two parties. God says, you walk with me and I'll deliver you and I will set you free from sin. Do we believe it? It's a covenant of faith. And it's an obedience that comes by faith. There's no room for this gospel that requires nothing of us and puts all and puts all the demands on God. It's just it's not a good gospel. It's not the right gospel. The gospel of the covenant relationship that we enter into with God requires of us to be faithful to a loving God who is more faithful than we are, more benevolent than we are, ready and eager to walk with us in covenant relationship. But we are bound by the words of the covenant. We're bound by the obedience required of the covenant. The power of it, the beauty of it, is that we've been given the Spirit of God to walk in that obedience and to have that covenant relationship with a benevolent God who's going to eventually defeat that pantheon of gods who are now controlling the nations. He is going to come back and defeat them and punish them for their rebellion. And he's going to save a people out of this fallen, corrupt situation for himself. And he's today entered into covenant relationship with those people and given power to walk in a newness of life, power to walk in a faith that it can deliver us not only from the guilt and the punishment of our sin, but from the power of our sin. How I wish we could all get a revelation of this and be a people that are walking worthy of the God who's called us. I know a lot of you are doing really well. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to beat anybody up. Most of you are doing really well. But is there anything wrong with trying to lift us up higher? Is there anything wrong with trying to call us into even a greater measure of obedience and submission and full surrender to our loving Father who's poured his Spirit out on us abundantly to empower us to do just that? He's a great and loving Father with great power. And I want to see all of us delivered from slavery to sin, delivered from whatever it is that's fighting us and controlling us, to whatever measure that is. Let's believe God and get even freer than we are today. Amen. God bless you guys. Next week we're gonna go off into. We've been studying the gospel message. Well, we're actually going to go off into one of the gospels, and we're going to start looking and working our way through the Gospel of Luke. Vic is going to do an introduction to that next week and get us started there, and hopefully that'll just be a really encouraging journey for all of us. God bless you guys. I know many of us are struggling right now, and my prayers are with you all. And try to remember to pray for all of us every day. And there's just a lot of hard things going on right now. And my heart is with you guys. I'm heavy with just concern for all the hard things going on, some of the illnesses and the deaths, unfortunately, untimely deaths, and just a lot of stuff going on. So we'll keep praying. God bless you guys, and love you all, and pray that you have a blessed week. See you soon.